I never imagined my daughter's graduation dinner would begin with betrayal. But then again, betrayal never shows up wearing horns. It comes dressed in pressed collars and polished shoes. It smiles while it sharpens the knife. The restaurant was the kind that still believed in white tablecloths and 3 forks, hollow oak old stone walls, candlelit sconces, a fireplace that crackled even in May. Camille chose it, said it felt grown up. She was right. The air was still, reverent, even, like we were seated in a cathedral where the only thing worshipped was legacy. My mother sat at the far end, clutching her pearls, as if they could string the family back together. My sister was on her second glass of wine, already telling the waiter about Camille's speech. And beside me sat the man I married. When I was barely older than our daughter, he had always loved being watched. Whether giving speeches or carving turkey, he performed. So, when he stood, I wasn't surprised. I thought maybe he was going to toast Camille, or give her a key to something he was fond of, grand gestures. I folded my napkin carefully in my lap and waited. "I have something I need to share with all of you," he said, voice calm but rehearsed. Camille looked up, bright-eyed. The candles caught in her lashes. She thought he was about to announce a gift or a trip. She always assumed the best of him. I used to as well. He cleared his throat, placed a hand on the back of my chair, like that touch still meant something. Then he said the words that shifted the entire evening off its axis. "I've decided, after 22 years of marriage, I need something different. I've filed for divorce. The paperwork was submitted last week. I've already moved out." The silence was immediate and surgical, like someone had sucked the air out of the room with a syringe. A clink of a fork. My sister's mouth slightly open. My mother frozen mid-sip. And Camille, my beautiful, brilliant Camille, looked at me. Not him. Me. As if searching my face for instructions on how to survive the next 10 seconds. I smiled. Not a big one. Just enough to show my teeth. Just enough to remind him he didn't know me half as well. As he thought, "Well," I said, reaching for my glass. "Congratulations." His eyes twitched, just a flicker. He hadn't expected that. He expected drama, gasps, maybe a scene, a woman undone by public humiliation. But I didn't give him that. I gave him something worse. I gave him nothing, just before the waiter returned to offer dessert. I reached into my purse and slid an envelope onto the table. Pale gray, unassuming, sealed with a wax stamp the color of dried blood. He looked at it like it might explode. "You'll want to read that," I said softly, tucking a strand of hair behind my ear. "Later, when you're alone." Camille didn't speak. Her knuckles were white around the stem of her glass. My sister cleared her throat, but no words followed. Only the low hum of the fireplace and the faint jazz track floating in from the main dining room. He didn't reach for the envelope. He didn't speak again. He just sat down slowly, eyes bouncing between the note and me. His hands, the same ones that once shook placing a ring on my finger, now trembled trying to fold a napkin. He had detonated our marriage with an audience, but he didn't realize I'd already cleared the debris. The waiter returned with a tray of crème brûlée. My mother murmured something about sugar being good for shock. No one laughed. My husband, no. The man I used to call my husband left the envelope untouched beside his plate, like a warning sign or a loaded weapon. Camille excused herself first, said she needed air. I let her go. Sometimes silence is kinder than comfort. He glanced at me one last time, like he was trying to see behind my eyes, to find some trace of the woman who once cried when he forgot her birthday. But she wasn't here anymore. I sipped my champagne, let the bubbles rise. Across the table, my sister leaned closer and whispered, What did you give him? I turned to her slowly, smiled. A mirror. A mirror. That's what I handed him, though he didn't realize it yet. Not the kind you hang above a sink, but the kind that shows a man who he truly is when no one's watching. I didn't need to scream. I didn't need to break down or plead for an explanation. Because by the time he stood up at that table to announce his betrayal like some twisted ribbon-cutting ceremony, I had already known. I had known for months. It started with a misstep, a charge on the Amex from a hotel that didn't match any business trip. He never made mistakes like that. But affairs, like rot, eventually find a way to seep through polished floors. I didn't confront him. Not right away. I let the lie sit, let it stretch, and breathe like dough rising in a bowl. A part of me waited, hoping he would confess, that he would remember who I was before I became his convenience. But men like him don't unravel. They calculate, they adjust their ties, and expect you to keep dinner warm. So I began collecting, not things, evidence and receipts, flight confirmations, hotel bookings, transfers from our joint account into an offshore one I wasn't supposed to know existed. The more I watched, the more carelessly he moved, like a man who believed himself untouchable. He smiled a little wider, stayed out a little later, began rehearsing false kindness in front of Camille, as if laying the groundwork for a new narrative, one in which I was cold, distant, responsible for the growing space between us. I played along. I packed his overnight bags. I laughed at his recycled jokes. I even left a bottle of wine out on the nights he didn't come home, so he could pretend he hadn't disappointed me. Again. And while he lied, I hired a lawyer, quiet, meticulous, a woman who once dismantled an oil tycoon's portfolio without ever stepping into a courtroom. She didn't ask why I wanted discretion. She just handed me a pen and said, "Start from the beginning." So I did. I told her about the prenup, his idea. Of course, back when we were newly married and he was still riding the high of a startup sale, he insisted on it, afraid I'd marry him for money. I signed it, believing that love didn't need safety nets. But here's the thing about contracts, they age like wine or milk, and his, with all its arrogance and assumptions, had fermented beautifully in my favor. My lawyer reviewed it, twice, then smiled with the kind of satisfaction you only see in women who enjoy poetic symmetry. "Does he know how much you know?" she asked me once. "No," I replied, and I plan to keep it that way. Camille noticed I was different. She thought I was sad. I wasn't. I was precise. I was learning how to wait in silence, not out of weakness. But strategy. He started leaving things behind, a sock under the bed, a business card in the laundry. He wanted to get caught. He wanted me to react, to scream, to accuse him, so he could justify whatever came next. But I didn't. I smiled. Every time. I kissed his cheek before he left and sent him texts with hearts and dinner plans. I wanted him to believe he was winning. Because the most dangerous place a powerful man can be is convinced he's the only one holding the cards. What he didn't know, what he never bothered to guess, was that I had changed. Quietly. Irrevocably. I was no longer the woman who curled into herself after arguments or walked on eggshells when he was in one of his moods. That woman was gone, buried under months of clarity and spreadsheets and screenshots. The day I signed the documents that would unwind our marriage was the same day I smiled at him over lunch and asked if he needed his suit dry cleaned. I printed everything: bank statements, call logs, photos on linen paper, bound them in a navy folder, tied it with twine. I wanted it to feel like a gift, a parting token. That envelope he left unopened beside the creme brulee. It held every secret he thought was safe, every careless mistake, every account, every betrayal, indexed, itemized, color-coded. He thought I would fall apart in front of family, that I'd be too shocked to breathe, but what he didn't realize is that I'd already mourned him, quietly, in silence. In the corners of empty rooms and long drives and Sunday nights spent staring at the ceiling, by the time he stood at that table and declared his freedom, I had already freed myself. He just hadn't opened the envelope yet. But I knew he would. Men like him always do. Curiosity masquerading as control. He probably waited until after dessert, after Camille left the room, after my mother gave him that look at the one she reserves for garden pests and disappointing sons-in-law. I imagine he opened it in his car, parked crooked behind the valet stand, heart pounding, palms damp, expecting maybe a letter, a confession, a final plea. What he found instead was the beginning of his own unraveling. Page 1 was a ledger. Every financial transfer from our joint account to his hidden ones. With dates, with amounts, with footnotes. Page 2 was the hotel receipt. Not the one from his first mistake, but from his fourth. The one where he registered under a false name. The one with the spa booking for 2. Page 3 was a transcript, a recording, actually, taken on a rainy Tuesday afternoon when he called someone his real future. He spoke of me in past tense, like I was a burden that had already been filed away. The kind of file you leave in a cabinet, so deep, you forget the sound of the drawer. But I didn't include everything. I held some things back, not because I was afraid, but because I wanted to keep my leverage supple, alive. Revenge isn't fire, where it's ice, it's timing. It's silence that waits. So long it becomes the only voice left in the room. The next day, he didn't call, didn't text, not even to Camille. That told me everything I needed to know. He wasn't strategizing, he was panicking. I waited 3 more days, made no move, said nothing to anyone. I let the envelope haunt him, let him read it again and again under the glow of the dashboard, or on the floor of his hotel room. He probably paced, wondered how much I knew. When I had begun watching, if I had told anyone, he didn't know that I had already filed, didn't know that the prenup, the one he crafted, so smugly contained a clause he never read carefully, a clause about moral turpitude, about public humiliation, about conduct that could bring harm to the family image. And he certainly didn't remember that I had insisted, years ago, that family image meant our daughter, too. Camille had seen the whole thing. She may not have understood it at first, but children always see through the fog faster than we expect. Her silence at dinner wasn't shock, and it was calculation. She inherited that from me. He thought she'd be his ally, thought he could spin a tale of we just grew apart, and your mother's always been distant. But Camille didn't believe in distance. She believed in truth. And 3 days after the envelope, she came to me. Her eyes were sharp, her voice was level. He's been lying for a long time, hasn't he? I nodded. No embellishments, no poison, just fact. She didn't cry. She just sat beside me on the patio, knees tucked to her chest, staring at the garden he once promised to help build. I used to think he was the stronger one, she said. He needed you to think that. I replied, and in that moment, something inside her shifted. I watched it happen, the death of illusion, the quiet kind that doesn't scream, doesn't break glass, but closes a door forever. That evening, I emailed my lawyer, told her we were ready. By the time the formal notice of divorce was delivered, he was already halfway into his own narrative, telling friends we'd grown distant, spinning stories about my coldness, about our incompatibility. He didn't expect the paperwork to cite breach of agreement, misappropriation of assets, reputational harm. He didn't expect Camille's name in the witness list. He didn't expect the recordings. He certainly didn't expect the bank freezes. When he finally showed up at the house again 2 weeks after the dinner, he was different. Not disheveled, but shaken, like someone trying to remember the script in a play he never rehearsed. He rang the bell. Didn't use his key. That told me he'd already tried. And failed. I answered in silence. He stood there, envelope in hand, lips parted, as if the right words might tumble out, if he waited long enough. I didn't think you'd... He began. I raised my hand. Just once. He stopped speaking. I let him in, but only to the foyer, only as far as the tile floor that still bore the scuff from his suitcase wheels the day he moved out. You blindsided me, he said finally, voice quiet. No, I replied. You miscalculated. His eyes darted across the room, looking for something, a sign of regret, maybe an open door, a second chance. But all he saw were cold floors and bare walls and a woman who no longer fit the mold he once shaped. He held up the envelope. Was this the whole plan? No. I said, this was the backup. This was the backup. He flinched, just barely, but I saw it. The way his fingers curled tighter around the envelope, as if squeezing it would somehow reverse what had already been set in motion. He opened his mouth again, then closed it. Silence suited him better. It was the first time in years he had nothing to perform. I didn't ask why he'd come. I already knew. The man who once measured every room by how brightly he could shine in it now stood in mine, trying not to disappear. It wasn't about love, not really. It was about control, about losing the narrative. I stepped past him, slow, deliberate, walked into the kitchen and turned on the kettle, let the hiss of boiling water fill the empty space between us. He followed me, like a shadow, learning to detach. You blindsided me, he repeated, like saying it again might make it true. I didn't answer. I placed 2 mugs on the counter. Mine with a crack near the lip one I refused to throw away. His, one he left behind months ago, still clean, still unused. He picked it up and held it like an artifact from another life. You planned this, he whispered. I finally turned to face him. No. I prepared for this. He didn't understand the difference. Not yet. I watched him try to stitch together a version of reality that could save face. Maybe he'd tell people I'd always been cold. That I shut him out. That I turned Camille against him. He'd leave out the affairs, the wire transfers, the backdoor deals. Men like him always rewrite the chapters where they're not the hero. But it didn't matter anymore. The court would hear it all. I slid a folder across the marble counter, thicker than the envelope, weightier. Inside were the dates for the hearings, the amended financial disclosures, the list of frozen assets. He stared at it, as if it were written in a language he never learned. Camille won't testify against me, he said suddenly, grasping at anything that might resemble a lifeline. She won't have to, I said. She'll just tell the truth. That silenced him. He stayed standing while I poured the tea. I didn't offer him any. I sat at the table, the one he used to lean on while sipping espresso and dictating emails. Now, he just hovered. The air around him no longer belonged. Did you ever love me? He asked. I looked up. I did. But you didn't notice until I stopped. That landed harder than anything in the envelope. He turned to leave, but paused near the door. She'll leave me. You know. I knew who he meant. The 26-year-old gallery assistant with an Instagram full of filtered sunsets and motivational quotes. She didn't know about the freeze or the prenup or the clause that converted infidelity into financial surrender. She already has, I said softly. The front door clicked shut behind him, and for the first time in years, the house exhaled. The days after moved quietly. No lawyers knocking, no dramatic phone calls, just steady steps toward the courtroom, toward restoration. Camille started coming home more often. She brought Thai takeout and stories about her campus life. but I noticed she asked more questions. About him, about me, about how women survive betrayal without turning bitter. "You don't seem angry," she said one night. I stirred my tea. "Anger is loud," I said. "Strategy is quiet." She nodded. Slowly. "Let it settle." I watched her file it away somewhere deep, somewhere useful. When the court dates arrived, he showed up in navy. Always navy, the color of control, but it fit looser now. His tie knotted too tightly, his collar pinched red. He didn't meet my eyes. He barely met the judges. The lawyer he hired was expensive, but nervous. Mine was calm, surgical. The kind of woman who doesn't blink when power shifts in the room. She handed the prenup across the table, highlighted the clause, cited his violations, referred to my evidence without theatrical flair. Truth doesn't need embellishment. He tried to interject once, tried to claim the finances were a misunderstanding, but his voice cracked. The judge raised a hand. "Let the documents speak," she said. And they did. Every page of that envelope spoke. Every transaction, every lie, every grainy photo he thought I'd never find. The courtroom wasn't dramatic. It was clinical, precise. By the time we left, the ruling was clear. He lost more than money. He lost the mask he'd worn for 2 decades. Outside the courthouse, Camille took my hand. "I'm proud of you," she said. I squeezed back. "Don't be proud," I whispered. "Be alert. Because one day, she might be the woman in the room holding the mirror. Because one day, she might be the woman in the room holding the mirror." I didn't want that for her. I didn't want her to inherit the silence I had worn like armor. But I knew the world had a way of handing women silence wrapped as strength and asking them to be grateful for the gift. So I didn't tell her to avoid betrayal. I told her to learn its rhythm, to recognize the footsteps of manipulation long before it reached the threshold. The house was quiet in the weeks that followed. I had the locks changed not out of fear, but finality. I replaced the bed, the curtains, the sheets he once liked in navy and white. I painted the walls a soft green, like sea glass. Something new, something untouched by hands that once bruised with absence. But I didn't throw everything away. Some things I kept. A photograph of Camille at age 10, sitting on his shoulders at the beach. The smile on her face was real. Not everything had been a lie. That's what made it so complicated. The good parts were true, but they weren't enough. He sent one email, just one. Subject line: regret. No greeting, no sign-off. Just a sentence buried in the middle like a confession too embarrassed to look at itself. "I thought you'd fall apart without me." I didn't reply. Not because I didn't have words, but because I'd already said everything in silence. He mistook my stillness for weakness, not realizing still water carves stone. He never understood that the woman he thought would shatter had instead been learning how to bend without breaking. His life began to recede, slowly, like water pulling away from shore after a storm. I heard whispers that the gallery assistant left him, that she'd never known about the prenup, that the apartment he'd rented in the city was being sold under him due to unpaid taxes. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. Misfortune is not justice, but clarity is. One afternoon, Camille forwarded me a text he'd sent her. "Tell your mother I miss the way she used to laugh." She didn't respond to him either. But that night, she walked into the kitchen while I was making tea and said, "He never deserved your laugh." We stood there for a long time. No music, no voices, just 2 women born from the same wound, learning how to live without infection. Months passed. I didn't remarry, I didn't date. I didn't reinvent myself with a new haircut or a reckless trip abroad. What I did was quieter, more permanent. I started a consultancy, financial literacy for women, asset protection, quiet planning. I taught women how to read contracts, how to find the clause no one points to, how to move money like men always assumed they never could. I named it the second draft, because that's what life had become. Not a new story, just a better written one. My first client was a mother of 3, married to a venture capitalist who reminded me too much of a past I'd already buried. She was scared, apologetic. Her voice trembled. When she asked if she had any options, I told her the truth. You have more than options. You have leverage. You just haven't named it yet. She cried when she left. Not because she was broken, but because she'd finally seen the hinges. Word spread slowly, quietly, like all things that matter. I didn't advertise, I didn't post testimonials. I let women find me the way I had found myself in silence, through strategy, at the very edge of giving up. Camille came by one day holding a box of office supplies. "What's this for?" I asked. She smiled. "I told my professor I want to intern with someone who practices justice without noise." I looked at her, really looked, and for the first time, I saw a version of myself untouched by bitterness. Someone who had learned from pain, but not built a home in it. We set up her desk beside mine. Later that evening, while filing case notes, she asked, "Do you ever think about him?" I didn't lie. Sometimes. What do you think? I closed the folder I was holding, placed it on the stack marked Resolved. I think he was never prepared to lose to someone who never raised her voice. She let out a breath, the kind that clears something old from the lungs. That night, after she left, I sat alone in the office and pulled open the drawer where I kept a single item from the past. The envelope, faded now, creased at the edges, still sealed. Not the one from the restaurant. That one he opened. This one his reply. The one he left on my doorstep weeks after everything collapsed. I never opened it. Still, haven't. Because I already know what it says. Because I already know what it says. Men like him always write the same words in the end. Some combination of remorse and revisionism. They say they were confused, that they felt unseen, that they didn't mean for things to go that far. But the truth is, they always meant to betray you. They just didn't think you'd ever notice. And when you do, when you rise without rage, when you dismantle their delusions brick by brick with a steady hand, they rewrite the story to make themselves feel like victims of your silence. That envelope stayed in the drawer. Still does. I see it every time I open it to reach for a pen, a file, a client form. It's a reminder not of him, but of the version of myself that stopped waiting for closure. Because some doors aren't meant to be knocked on. They're meant to be locked and left behind. I still see pieces of him in the world sometimes. In the restaurant on 5th that still serves his favorite scotch. In the flash of a navy blazer ducking into a car that isn't his anymore. In Camille's cheekbones, sharp like his mother's. But they don't cut me. Not anymore. Camille graduated college with honors. She wore a simple white dress and walked across the stage like she'd been born to. Afterward, she hugged me longer than usual and whispered, "I know what you gave up, so I could get here." I didn't respond. Some things are too sacred for words. At the celebration dinner, we sat at the same restaurant, Hollow Oak, the same table, same linen, but the room felt different, lighter, no shadows in the corners, no illusions clinging to the chairs. My mother was there, older, slower, but proud in a way only grandmothers can be. My sister had flown in from Chicago, her hair longer, her laugh louder. And Camille, now a woman, toasted to the future without looking back. He wasn't invited. He didn't even ask. Maybe he knew. Or maybe he finally learned what it meant to be unwelcome in a room he used to command. That night, Camille and I walked the long way back to the car. The spring air was soft, laced with lilac and memory. She reached into her purse and handed me something without speaking. A postcard, no return address, just a photo of the sea, and 5 words scrawled in ink I recognized. I see it now. I'm sorry. I stared at it for a moment, let the words settle like dust that wouldn't cling. Then I folded it in half and placed it in my coat pocket. I wouldn't keep it. I wouldn't destroy it either. Some apologies aren't for forgiveness. They're just proof that the silence was louder than the scream. That night, I didn't dream of him. I dreamt of blueprints, of women standing in rooms they built themselves, rooms with doors that locked from the inside, not the outside. The consultancy grew, slowly, then all at once. Women brought women, mothers brought daughters, lawyers sent clients. Even therapists referred patients who needed more than healing. They needed strategy. I called it emotional architecture, teaching women how to build lives with exits. Not because they planned to leave, but because they deserved the choice. One client, a woman in her 60s, held my hands after her final session and said, "You've turned silence into a weapon." I smiled, but gently. Not a weapon. I told her, a tool, one they never saw coming. Camille started leading sessions on financial literacy for young women. She had a way of making compound interest sound like poetry. I watched her once, speaking to a room of college freshmen, her voice steady, her posture proud. A woman who had seen what happens when trust is misplaced and still chose to trust herself. She asked me later, "Do you ever wish it hadn't happened? I thought about it longer than I expected. I wish he had been someone else." I said, "But I don't wish I hadn't learned who I am." There are nights I still walk through the garden, the one we once planned together. Back, when we still believed in the future we were sold. The roses are gone. I replaced them with herbs, lavender, thyme, mint, things that grow quietly, serve quietly, endure quietly. The envelope is still in the drawer, and every time I see it, I remember that night in the restaurant. The clink of cutlery, the silence. The moment a woman handed back the narrative without saying a word, he thought it was the end, but it was the beginning. But it was the beginning of a life no longer written in reaction, a life designed, not endured. People always think revenge is a moment, a single, sharp act that severs past from present. But they're wrong. Real revenge is patient. It reshapes the air. It makes you invisible until the moment you decide to be seen again. A year passed before I saw him in person. It was at a fundraising gala. I hadn't planned to go, but one of my clients, a judge, newly divorced, invited me as her guest. The venue was glass and chrome and string quartets, the kind of place where men like him used to thrive. Camille was away that weekend, visiting a friend in Vermont, or else I might have begged her to come. Not for protection, just for balance. I wore black, not as a statement, but because it felt like armor. He spotted me first. I felt his stare before I turned. He hadn't changed much. Slightly thinner, his hair grayer at the temples. He looked like a man still trying to perform someone else's confidence. I stood beside the judge, sipping my wine, nodding politely at stories I didn't need to remember. And when I turned, he was already walking toward me. No mistress in tow, no entourage, just him, alone. He stopped a few steps away. I said nothing. The judge, sensing the shift in temperature, excused herself with grace. He cleared his throat, hands in his pockets. "I didn't expect to see you here." I nodded once. Neutral, civil, unmoved. "You look strong," he added after a pause. "I am," I said. We stood there like two people who used to speak a shared language, but now only knew fragments. He looked at his shoes, then back at me. I'm not here to reopen anything, he said. I wanted to say, thank you. That made me blink. Not in surprise, in curiosity. Thank you, I asked. Voice even. He nodded. You didn't destroy me. You just let me do it to myself, and somehow that was worse. But better. I tilted my head. Not to agree. Not to soften. Just to acknowledge that. For the first time, he might be telling the truth. Then I accept your gratitude. I said, but not your redemption. He didn't flinch. That's fair. We stood there a moment longer. 2 statues in a room of motion. He didn't ask about Camille. He knew better. He didn't ask about my work. He'd already read the articles. He simply said, take care, and walked away. I watched him vanish into a crowd that no longer turned to him. Later that evening, as I stepped into the town car, waiting out front, I realized something simple, but profound. He no longer lived in my story. He was a character in a prologue. Necessary, perhaps, but no longer present. At home. I lit a candle in the kitchen. Not for him. Not for grief. Just for stillness. The soft kind that settles on countertops and windowsills and the space behind your rib cage when you finally exhale. The next morning, I woke up before the sun, poured coffee into my chipped mug, opened my laptop to prepare a workshop on estate law and asset shielding. But something drew me to the drawer, the envelope, still there, unopened, still waiting like a ghost at the edge of the garden. I pulled it out, held it in both hands, turned it over, and then, slowly, I placed it on the counter. I didn't open it. Not because I couldn't, but because I didn't need to anymore. It had already told me everything I needed to know without saying a word. Later that week, Camille and I took a weekend trip. Just the 2 of us. A cabin in the mountains, no reception, just trees, tea, and long conversations about nothing and everything. On the second night, she asked me, do you think people like him ever change? I looked at her across the fireplace, the flames dancing in her eyes. No, I said, but we do. That's what matters. She smiled, not because she agreed, but because she understood. There's a kind of justice that doesn't make noise. It doesn't knock on courtroom doors or scream in public squares. It simply outlasts. And that's what I did. I outlasted. Not in spite of the silence, but because of it. There's power in not defending yourself, in not explaining, in letting someone paint their version of the truth, knowing the canvas will eventually peel on its own. The people who mattered, they saw, not all at once, but slowly, in the way I walked differently, in the way I stopped apologizing for taking up space. After the gala, the invitations came more frequently, speaking engagements, panels, podcasts. Everyone wanted to know the same thing. How did I keep my dignity when everything around me begged for spectacle? The answer was never elegant, ever. It was simple. I prepared for the fire long before the first spark, and when it came, I didn't panic. I stood still and let it burn what was never mine to begin with. Camille, and I moved into a new place 6 months later, smaller, brighter, with a kitchen that caught the afternoon sun just right. She chose it, said she wanted a space that felt like beginning, not aftermath. We left most of the old furniture behind, except for one thing, the desk. The one I used to draft every legal document, every timeline, every receipt I'd collected in silence. She wanted it for her own work. I want to remember where we started, she said. Not where we broke, but where we began to rebuild. I kept the consultancy running. Though I took fewer clients, I didn't need to be needed anymore. I just needed to be present. Some women came just to talk. They weren't in danger. They weren't ready to leave. They just wanted someone to tell them what no one else would. You're not crazy, you're just early. And he's not clever. He's just used to you not paying attention. Every time I said those words, I watched something shift. A flicker, a breath, a spine straightening beneath the weight of years. He emailed me one more time, a year to the day after the dinner. The subject line was blank. The message was 2 sentences. I'm getting help. Not for you. For me. I didn't reply. Not because I didn't care, but because it wasn't mine to carry. We lose so much time trying to fix broken people, but we rarely ask who handed us the glue, who told us that mending others was our measure of worth. Camille stopped calling him, not out of anger, just absence. She said once, over coffee, I don't hate him, I just stopped hoping. That's when I knew she was free. Freedom isn't loud either. It's the quiet click of the front door closing behind someone who no longer lives here. On the first anniversary of the divorce, we had dinner. Just us. No speeches, no candles, just takeout on the floor of our new place, laughing over an old sitcom playing too loud. At one point, she looked at me and said, I think I finally understand why you didn't scream. I paused, waited, because it would have made him the story. She said, I didn't nod. I didn't smile. I just handed her another dumpling. That night, before bed, I opened the drawer. The envelope was still there. And finally, I picked it up, walked to the window, and opened it. Not with expectation, not with fear, just curiosity. Inside was a letter, handwritten, neat, careful. He talked about therapy, about guilt, about memories of me reading on the porch, hair tied back, always still. He said he missed the way I let silence stretch, that it was never uncomfortable with me, that it was full. Then, a line that stopped me. I used to think I had power, because you were quiet. Now I realize you were quiet, because you had power. I folded the letter. No tears came. Not because I wasn't moved, but because I had already lived its truth. Camille found me by the window a few minutes later. You okay? She asked. Yes. I said, I was just closing a file, and I meant it. Some files don't need to be burned. They just need to be put away. They just need to be put away. And once they are, you realize how much space they were taking, not just in drawers or inboxes or calendars, but in your mind, in your breath, in the way you move through rooms. Closure isn't a moment, it's an absence. It's waking up one morning and forgetting, just for a second, to remember the pain, and then doing it again the next day. Life began to move differently after that. Not faster, just cleaner. No more double-checking my words. No more managing his shadows. I slept deeper. I laughed longer. I started playing piano again, clumsy, slow, with fingers that forgot, and relearned at the same time. Not for performance, for pleasure. Camille. And I planted new things that spring. Tomatoes, basil, daisies, things that need care, but give back more than they take. Things that don't bloom all at once, but stretch quietly toward light. Sometimes I get asked if I'd do it the same way again, if I'd wait, stay silent, strategize instead of scream, and the answer is always yes, because fire consumes, but silence reclaims. He took 12 years of my life and tried to walk away with 20 more, but what he left behind was more valuable than anything he ever gave. He left behind the space for me to become dangerous in my stillness, the kind of woman who doesn't beg, the kind who lets you go on thinking you've won until you open the envelope. And maybe one day, Camille will stand at her own kind of crossroads. Maybe she'll be betrayed. Maybe she won't. But If she is, I hope she remembers this, that her power lives not in her reaction, but in her restraint. That justice doesn't always arrive in courtrooms or confessions. Sometimes it arrives folded, neatly, waiting patiently beside a plate of untouched dessert. And when it does, she won't need to raise her voice. She'll just need to remember that I once stood in a room full of people, had my life shattered in public, and smiled as I handed over the first piece of his unraveling. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I had already won, and that's how silence speaks. With steady hands, with sealed envelopes, and with the kind of grace that feels, to the guilty, like a blade. Thank you all for listening to my story until the very end. I hope that, even just a little, what I've shared can bring something meaningful to you. Goodbye, and see you again.